She built his $10 billion empire, then he handed her a termination letter and lost it all. In one day she did not scream. She did not cry. She did not throw anything across the room or say a single word that she would later regret. She simply read the letter, folded it, placed it back in the envelope, set the envelope on his desk, picked up her notepad, and said, in a voice so calm it made the people nearby uncomfortable, "I will need 2 weeks to transition my responsibilities." Then she turned and walked out, and the man sitting behind that desk, the man she had loved for 23 years, married for 20, built a $10 billion empire beside, carried through every failure, celebrated every success, given her youth and her ambition and her name to, watched her go, and looked back at his phone. He thought that was the end of it. He was wrong. What happened in the 90 days that followed that envelope is one of the most devastating cases of a man destroying everything he had by underestimating the one person who actually built it. And by the time he understood what he had done, it was already too late to undo any of it. Before we go any further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Margaret Ellen Briggs was born in 1971 in Columbus, Ohio, the middle child of 3 daughters, raised by a high school science teacher and a mother who worked as a bookkeeper for a family-owned hardware store. She was, by every account of people who knew her growing up, the kind of person who made things work, not in a loud or showy way. Margaret was never the loudest person in any room she entered, but she had a quality that the people closest to her recognized early and would spend the rest of their lives depending on. She understood systems. She understood how things connected to each other, how a decision made in one place created consequences in another, how the difference between something that held together and something that fell apart was almost always found in the details that most people found too tedious to examine carefully. Her mother used to say that Margaret could look at anything, a family budget, a school project, a broken appliance, and see not just what it was but how it was supposed to work and exactly where it had gone wrong. It was, as gifts go, not the most glamorous one, but it was the kind of gift that builds things, and Margaret Briggs was, from the very beginning, a builder. She arrived at the University of Michigan's Business School in the fall of 1991 on a partial academic scholarship, and a determination that was, by the testimony of her roommate, from that first year, almost uncomfortable to be around in the best possible way. She studied harder than most people around her, not because she was less naturally gifted, but because she believed. Genuinely, without performance, that preparation was a form of respect. Respect for the work, respect for the people depending on you, respect for the opportunity itself. She was not the most socially prominent person in her program. She did not go to every party or sit at the center of every conversation, but she was the person that other students came to when a project was falling apart or a presentation needed to be rebuilt from the ground up the night before it was due. She was, in the language of people who have since tried to describe her, the person who made other people better without making them feel lesser for needing help. And it was in the second semester of her first year, in a study group that met every Tuesday evening in the basement of the business school library, that she met Daniel Prescott. Daniel Prescott was everything that Margaret was not, in the specific way that makes two people immediately and irresistibly interesting to each other. Where she was precise, he was intuitive. Where she was careful, he was bold. Where she spent an hour thinking through the implications of a decision before she made it, he had already made the decision, communicated it to everyone involved, and moved on to the next thing, and was right often enough that his speed felt like genius rather than recklessness. He was tall, easy in his own skin, with the kind of confidence that does not need to prove itself because it has never seriously been questioned. He laughed easily and often. He remembered everyone's name. He had a way of listening to you, really listening, not waiting for his turn to speak, that made you feel, when you were talking to him, like you were the most interesting person he had encountered in a long time. Margaret noticed all of this. She also noticed, because she noticed everything, that underneath the confidence and the charm and the easy laughter, there was a man who was occasionally, quietly, afraid of failing. And that small human vulnerability, visible only in certain moments, only to people paying close enough attention, was the thing that made her fall in love with him. They were friends first, for almost 2 years. The kind of friends who talk about everything. About their families, their ambitions, their fears, their ideas about what they wanted their lives to look like. Daniel wanted to build something. He had always known that about himself. He was not made for working inside someone else's structure, answering to someone else's vision, building someone else's dream. He wanted to create. He wanted to found something that had his name on it and his mark on it, and that would still be standing long after he was gone. Margaret listened to him talk about this vision across dozens of late-night conversations in that library basement, and in the diners they went to afterward, and she felt something that she would not name for a long time, but that she recognized. She wanted to help him build it. Not because she lacked ambitions of her own, she had plenty, but because she understood, with the same clarity she brought to everything, that what Daniel was describing needed exactly the kind of person she was. His vision needed her architecture. His boldness needed her precision. His speed needed her caution. They were not just compatible. They were, in a very specific and practical sense, necessary to each other. And by the time they both graduated in the spring of 1993, that necessity had become something neither of them could imagine living without. They dated for 3 years before Daniel proposed, on a November evening in 1996, in the apartment they were already sharing in Chicago, where Daniel had taken a position at a management consulting firm, and Margaret was building a reputation as a financial analyst, with an instinct for identifying value that her supervisors described in performance reviews she still has somewhere in a filing cabinet as genuinely rare. The proposal was not elaborate. There was no restaurant, no audience, no choreographed moment. He simply came home one evening, sat across from her at the kitchen table where she was working, waited until she looked up and said, "I think we should get married. I think we should build everything together. I think you are the only person I have ever met who I genuinely cannot do this without." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I know." They were married the following June, in a small ceremony in Columbus attended by their families and the friends who had watched them become themselves together. Margaret wore her mother's earrings. Daniel cried during the vows, which surprised everyone who thought they knew him and surprised nobody who actually did. Their first child, a daughter they named Rachel, was born in 1998. Their second, a son named James, arrived 14 months later, in what Margaret would later describe as the most logistically demanding period of her life. Because 1999 was also the year that Daniel came to her, with the idea that would define the next 2 decades of both their lives. He wanted to start an investment firm. Not a large, institutional firm, something boutique, focused, built around a thesis that he had been developing for 2 years and that he believed was ahead of its time, sustainable infrastructure investment. In the years before, that phrase meant anything to most of the industry. He sat across from her at the same kitchen table where he had proposed, with Rachel asleep in the next room and Margaret nursing James, and he laid out the plan with the specific excitement of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something out loud. She listened to all of it. She asked 12 questions, each one more precise than the last, and when he was finished, she said, "The thesis is right. The timing is risky. The only way it works is if we build the client relationships before we build the brand, and we do it together. Both names on everything." He agreed without hesitation. He almost always agreed with Margaret when it came to strategy in those early years. They named the firm Prescott Callaway Partners, both names, on the door. What followed was years of building that most people never see and that history almost never records. The grinding, unglamorous, essential work of creating something real from nothing. Margaret was nursing a 14-month-old and managing a newborn, while simultaneously building the risk frameworks, the client management systems, the due diligence processes, and the internal culture of a firm that did not yet have a track record to offer anyone. She worked during nap times, and after bedtimes, and on weekend mornings before anyone else was awake. She took calls from clients while standing in the kitchen making lunches. She drafted proposal documents at the kitchen table after Daniel had gone to sleep. She did this not because she had no choice, but because she believed in what they were building, believed in him, believed that the combination of his vision and her architecture was genuinely capable of becoming something extraordinary. And because she loved him, that part is important. She did not do it transactionally, calculating what she would get in return. She did it the way you do things for people you love, which is to say she did it without keeping score, which is to say she did it in a way that would become, years later, very difficult to prove. The early years of Prescott Callaway Partners were sustained almost entirely on the strength of Margaret's relationships. She had spent 6 years before the firm's founding building a professional network grounded entirely in her personal reputation for honesty, for precision, for never telling a client what they wanted to hear when what they needed to hear was different. Those relationships were the bridge that carried the firm across the gap between its founding and its first real track record. Clients who invested in those early years did not invest because of the firm's history, which barely existed. They invested because of Margaret Calloway, who did. She called it, in an internal document she wrote years later, the bridge period. What she meant, though she did not say it in those exact words, was, I saved it. I saved it with my relationships, my reputation, and years of work I did before I ever met Daniel Prescott, and I brought all of that into this firm and gave it to what we were building together. That is what the bridge period was, and Daniel knew it. In those years, he knew it completely, and he was grateful in the way that only people who understand what they have been given can be grateful. That gratitude, too, would change. Through the early years of building the firm, Margaret was also building a home. Not metaphorically, literally. She was the parent who knew Rachel's teacher's name and James's best friend's mother's phone number, and which pediatrician was taking new patients, and what time the school play started, and whether there was a conflict with the quarterly investor meeting that Daniel had scheduled for the same evening. She was the person who made sure the children had what they needed, while Daniel was on a plane to a meeting or a conference or a dinner that would turn into a relationship that would eventually become a client. She did this without complaint and without martyrdom. She was not a woman who needed recognition for every task she completed, but she was aware, in the precise way that she was aware of everything, of the arithmetic of it, of the hours she spent on things that would never appear on a balance sheet or a pitch deck or a Forbes profile, of the invisible infrastructure of a family and a marriage and a home that made it possible for Daniel Prescott to walk into rooms and be the unencumbered, focused, charismatic version of himself that investors found so compelling. She was the reason he could be that person, and for a long time he knew it. The financial crisis of 2008 was the moment that revealed, with complete clarity, what Margaret Calloway had built. While firms across the investment landscape collapsed or contracted in ways that destroyed years of work and billions of dollars of client wealth, Prescott Calloway Partners not only survived, but emerged with its reputation significantly enhanced. The sectors Margaret had insisted on focusing on proved more resilient than almost any comparable portfolio in the market. The risk frameworks she had built and had defended against pressure to loosen in the years before the crisis held exactly as she had designed them to hold, and the client relationships she had personally cultivated, relationships grounded in honesty and maintained through years of consistent, genuine communication, held too. Not one significant client left during the crisis. Margaret had called each of them personally in the days before the worst of it hit. She told them the truth about their exposure. She walked them through exactly what the firm was doing and why. She did not minimize. She did not perform calm. She did not feel. She simply told the truth, because she had always told the truth, and her clients knew it. And that knowledge was worth more in that moment than any amount of marketing or crisis communication strategy. She made 41 calls in 3 days. She barely slept. Not one of those clients left. Daniel emerged from the crisis as a public figure in a way he had never quite been before. The firm's performance became a story, a compelling, counterintuitive story about a boutique investment firm that had been right about sustainable infrastructure before anyone else was paying attention, and that had held together through the worst financial crisis in a generation, while larger, more celebrated firms had come apart. Daniel was invited to tell that story at conferences, in boardrooms, in media interviews, in a TED Talk that would eventually accumulate over 14 million views. He was articulate and compelling and genuinely knowledgeable, and the story he told was true in every factual particular. But it was a story told in the first person, a story about his vision, his conviction, his decision to build differently. Margaret appeared in that story the way a building's foundation appears in a photograph of a skyline, invisibly, bearing all the weight, present in every outcome but visible in none of them. She was quoted in a magazine profile of Daniel that ran in 2010, once, in the third paragraph, as a co-founder who oversaw operations. She read that paragraph. She did not say anything about it to Daniel. She simply, quietly, began keeping more detailed records than she had kept before. Rachel was 12 and James was 11 when the distance between their parents began to be something the children could feel rather than just sense. It did not arrive dramatically. It arrived the way most distances arrive in long marriages, in the accumulation of small absences, small redirections, small moments of connection that were offered and not received. Daniel was traveling more. He was in demand in a way he had never been before, and that demand had its own momentum, its own gravity, its own way of reorganizing a person's sense of what was essential and what could wait. Margaret could wait. The children could wait. The kitchen table conversations that had once been the place where everything important between them happened had been replaced gradually by briefings, by updates, by the kind of communication that two business partners maintain, efficient and informative and almost entirely stripped of the quality that had once made being in a room with Daniel Prescott feel like the best place to be, she noticed. She always noticed. She told herself, as people in long marriages tell themselves, that it was a phase, that the demands would ease, that he would come back to her. She told herself this for longer than she should have. It was in 2012 that the first significant thing happened, the thing that Margaret would later identify in the careful retrospective clarity that painful experiences eventually produce, as the moment when the direction of everything became visible if you were willing to look at it honestly. Daniel hired a new chief strategy officer, a man named Robert Haynes, who had a background in aggressive growth investment and who shared Daniel's belief that the firm was capable of scaling far beyond its current size if it was willing to move faster. Margaret had concerns. She raised them in writing, in a formal memo addressed to Daniel and filed with the board. She was precise about her concerns, as she was precise about everything. She did not object to growth. She objected to the specific culture that Haynes represented, the willingness to treat speed as more important than soundness, the tendency to see client relationships as transactions rather than partnerships. She had built this firm on the opposite philosophy, and she believed, with the same conviction she had brought to every important decision she had ever made, that changing that philosophy would eventually cost them something they could not afford to lose. Daniel acknowledged the memo. He thanked her for it. He hired Haynes anyway. The year after Robert Haynes arrived was the year that Rachel told Margaret, on a Saturday afternoon in the kitchen while they were making lunch, that she thought something was wrong with Dad. Margaret asked her what she meant. Rachel was 13 years old and already had her mother's quality of noticing things. She said, "He looks at us like we're something he has to get through before he can get to the next thing." Margaret did not respond immediately. She finished making the sandwich she was making. She handed it to Rachel, and then she said, "Your dad loves you very much." It was true, and it was not an answer to what Rachel had said. They both knew it. Rachel took her sandwich and went to her room, and Margaret stood in that kitchen for a long time, because what her 13-year-old daughter had just described was also, precisely and painfully, her own experience. She simply had not yet said it out loud to anyone. She had been too busy holding everything together to find the words for what was coming apart. The rebranding happened in 2014. The firm became Prescott Capital, just one name. On the door, on the letterhead, on the business cards, on the website, on the conference banners, on everything. It was framed as a modernization, cleaner, more scalable, more appropriate for a firm entering a new phase of growth. Margaret was consulted. She raised concerns formally in writing, as she always did. The concerns were documented. The rebranding went ahead. And Margaret Calloway's name disappeared from the institution she had co-founded, as quietly and as completely as if it had never been there. She drove past the building the week after the new signage went up and sat in her car in the parking structure across the street and looked at it for a long time. Just one name where two names had been. She did not cry, which surprised her. She felt something else, a specific cold quality of clarity that she recognized from other moments in her life when something had shifted permanently and irrevocably, and the only honest response was to understand it rather than grieve it. She drove home. She updated her records, and she made a phone call to the lawyer who had drafted her original employment contract 15 years earlier. Daniel and Margaret's marriage had been in private difficulty for several years before it became something that could not be privately managed. By 2016, they were living, in the language that marriage counselors use, parallel lives, present in the same house, performing the same family, occupying the same calendar, but no longer genuinely inhabiting the same emotional reality. The conversations they had were about logistics. about Rachel's college applications and James's basketball schedule and the renovation of the kitchen that Margaret had been planning for 2 years. And that kept getting delayed because there was always something more urgent requiring Daniel's attention. The physical affection that had once been easy and natural between them had become occasional and slightly formal, like something being maintained out of habit rather than felt. Margaret suggested counseling twice. The first time, Daniel agreed it was probably a good idea and then did not follow through on scheduling it. The second time, he said he did not think they needed that every long marriage went through periods like this, that things would settle down once the firm's expansion into new markets was complete. She did not suggest it a third time. She simply began, with the same methodical precision she brought to every other important project of her life, to prepare for the conversation she now understood was eventually coming. What none of them knew, not Daniel, not Robert Haynes, not the board members who had voted to support the firm's new direction, was the degree to which Margaret Calloway had spent the previous 4 years, quietly and legally organizing her affairs in preparation for an outcome she had not wanted, but had become too honest with herself to deny was likely. She had documented everything, every client relationship she had originated or maintained, every risk framework she had built, every internal communication she had sent raising concerns that had been received and not acted on. She had reviewed her employment contract in detail with her lawyer and understood precisely what it entitled her to in the event of termination, without cause, including critically the right to maintain professional contact with clients she had personally originated or served as primary relationship manager. She had kept copies of everything she was legally entitled to keep. She had made no threats, taken no hostile action, said nothing to clients or colleagues that was not completely within her professional rights. She had simply prepared, the way she had always prepared, with a precision that most people would not recognize as preparation at all, because it looked exactly like the way she did everything. In 2017, Margaret discovered something that she had not been looking for, and that changed the nature of everything she had been preparing for. She found, in the way that people in failing marriages sometimes find things, not through investigation but through the particular alertness of someone who has learned to read the small signals, evidence that Daniel had been involved with someone else. The details of what she found and how she found them are not something she has ever discussed publicly. What she has said, to the very small number of people she trusts completely, is that the discovery did not destroy her the way she would have expected it to, because by the time she found it, she had already, over the preceding years, been losing him in every way that actually mattered. The physical betrayal was, in some terrible sense, simply the explicit version of something that had already been happening for a long time in ways that had no name. She did not confront him immediately. She sat with what she knew for 3 months. She updated her records. She had 2 long conversations with her lawyer. She called her oldest friend, a woman she had known since college, and talked for 4 hours. And then she went back to her life and her work and her children, and she waited. Not passively, deliberately, with the patience of someone who understands that timing is part of strategy. April 14th, 2019. That is the date that everything converged. Margaret arrived at the office at her usual time, carrying her usual bag, nodding to the colleagues she passed in the lobby the way she did every morning. Daniel's assistant called her at 9:10 and asked if she could come to Daniel's office at 9:15. She said, of course. She picked up her notepad, as she always did, because she always took notes, because she believed that what was said in important meetings deserved to be recorded accurately. She walked to his office. He was standing when she arrived, which was unusual enough that she registered it immediately. Daniel was a man who sat, who leaned back, who occupied space with the ease of someone who had never felt unwelcome anywhere. Standing meant something was different. He handed her an envelope without speaking. She opened it. She read the 4 paragraphs inside, which informed her that her position had been eliminated and her services were no longer required, with a separation package outlined on the second page. She read it once. She placed the letter back in the envelope. She set the envelope on his desk. She picked up her notepad, and she said, quietly and without any audible emotion, "I will need 2 weeks to properly transition my responsibilities." And she walked out. He did not say anything. He looked at his phone. The people who were on the office floor that morning and watched Margaret walk back to her desk described her, afterward, in terms that have stayed with everyone who heard them. One colleague said she looked like someone who had already decided something a long time ago and was simply watching the last piece fall into place. Another said she wasn't upset, she was done. There's a difference, and I didn't understand what that difference looked like until I saw it on her face that morning. She spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly what she said she would do, transitioning her responsibilities with a thoroughness that her colleagues found, in retrospect, almost extraordinary in its completeness. She documented processes that had never been written down because they had lived in her. She organized client files in a way that gave whoever came after her the best possible chance of maintaining those relationships correctly. She did her job until the last possible moment with the same care and the same precision she had brought to it since 1999. And on her last day, she collected her personal items, which were few, because she had never been a person who decorated her workspace with much, and she walked out of the building. A colleague who was near the elevator that afternoon said she paused for just a moment before the doors opened. Just a breath. And then she straightened her shoulders and stepped in, and the doors closed. The separation that followed the termination was processed through lawyers. By the time Margaret walked out of that building, the legal machinery of the end of her marriage had already been in motion for 4 months. Daniel did not know this. He had believed, with the specific blindness of someone who had been consistently underestimating the same person for a decade, that the termination of her employment and the management of the marriage end would proceed on his timeline, and according to his preferences. He had believed that Margaret would be upset, perhaps angry, perhaps emotional in ways that would need to be managed. He had not believed, had genuinely not understood, that he was not the one managing anything, that the woman who had built everything he had ever built, who had seen every move before it was made in every business context they had ever shared, had been several steps ahead of this moment for longer than he had realized. The divorce proceedings, when they began formally, revealed the full scope of what Margaret had documented. Her contributions to the firm, financial, relational, operational, strategic, were recorded in a level of detail that her legal team described as the most comprehensive record of professional contribution they had ever encountered in a matrimonial case involving business assets. The financial settlement took 11 months to negotiate. The details remain confidential, as both parties agreed they would be. What is known, from people close to both sides of the proceeding, is that the settlement was considerably more than Daniel had anticipated, and considerably more reflective of Margaret's actual contribution to the firm's value than his initial position had acknowledged. Her lawyer, in a conversation recounted by someone who was present, said at one point during the negotiations, "My client did not build half of this company. She built the half that made the other half possible. And we have 20 years of documentation to demonstrate exactly what that means." The negotiations continued for several more months after that statement. The final settlement reflected, in the only language that legal proceedings have available to them, the weight of what she had contributed. It did not fully capture it. Nothing could fully capture it. But it was closer to honest than the envelope on the desk had been. Now, here is the part of this story that I want you to pay very close attention to, because what happened to Prescott Capital in the weeks and months following Margaret's departure is not just a business story. It is a human story about what happens when you remove the person who holds everything together and assume, with complete confidence, that what they were doing can simply be redistributed among people who do not yet understand what they are holding. The new executive team was talented. Robert Haynes was smart and driven, but they did not have what Margaret had. The 20 years of institutional knowledge, the client relationships grounded in personal trust built over decades, the risk discipline that had kept the firm alive through its most dangerous years. Clients began to notice. Not immediately. The first 6 weeks were quiet, but in week 7, the calls started. Long-term clients who had questions that the new team could not answer correctly. Clients who called their lawyers. Clients who called each other. And clients who, exercising the precise instinct that had made them successful enough to be Prescott Capital clients in the first place, called Margaret Calloway, she answered. She told the truth. She answered only what she was legally permitted to answer. But the truth, as it turned out, was enough. And before we go further, I want to pause right here and ask you something. Have you ever been the person in this story who held everything together while someone else's name was on the door? Have you ever loved someone so completely that you gave them the best years of your life, the best of your ability, the best of everything you had, and watch them look back at their phone? Tell us in the comments, because I promise you, you are not alone. And the story of what Margaret did next is for every single person who has ever been where she was standing. Now, back to Prescott Capital, because what happened next is the part that changed everything. Within 3 weeks of those first client calls, withdrawal reviews had begun across 9 of Prescott Capital's most significant accounts. Within 6 weeks, 7 of those reviews had converted into formal withdrawal notices. The combined assets leaving the firm represented a number large enough to send a signal that the market could not ignore. And in the investment world, when long-term institutional clients begin leaving simultaneously, the question is never just about the money. The question that travels through every trading desk, and analyst office, and financial newsroom that picks up the signal is always the same. What do they know that we do not? That question, once it enters the air, does not need an answer to do damage. It only needs to exist. It existed loudly enough that by the morning of June 24, 2019, a prominent financial journalist had posted a single tweet, just the firm's name and a question mark, nothing else. That was shared thousands of times within the hour. By 9:30 that morning, 3 financial publications had posted pieces asking what was happening at Prescott Capital. By noon, Daniel had called an emergency board meeting, and by the time the market closed that afternoon, everything that Margaret had spent 20 years building had lost $10 billion in value in a single day. The board met in emergency session 2 days later. Daniel presented a recovery plan. It was detailed and well-structured, and under any normal circumstances would have been persuasive. But the board that met that day was not the same board that had voted to support Margaret's termination 2 months earlier. People who had been privately uncomfortable with that decision had spent the intervening weeks watching their discomfort become reality in the most expensive possible way. The vote on whether to give Daniel authority to implement his own recovery plan was 4-4, a tie, and under the firm's governance documents that Margaret Calloway had helped draft in 2003. A tied vote meant the motion did not carry. A second motion was put forward to appoint an independent management committee to oversee operations pending a full governance review. That motion passed 5-3. By the end of that meeting, Daniel Prescott was still the founder and majority shareholder of the company. He was no longer running it. He sat alone in the boardroom after everyone else had filed out, in the building that carried only his name, and the room was very quiet. And the quiet had a specific quality. The quality of a space that has finally stopped pretending. The Independent Management Committee's report, published 10 weeks later, ran to 206 pages. It identified the departure of the firm's co-founder as the primary destabilizing event in the sequence that led to the collapse. It documented the erosion of institutional knowledge and client relationship infrastructure over a period of years. It named specific decisions, the rebranding, the executive restructuring, the acceleration of the risk approval process, as contributing factors in the firm's vulnerability. It did not use the word betrayal anywhere in its 206 pages, but it scribed, in careful and precise corporate language, exactly what betrayal looks like when it is wearing the clothes of strategic restructuring. And buried in the appendix on page 189 was a reference to a memo written by Margaret Calloway in 2016, 3 years before her termination, in which she had formally identified the specific risks that would materialize if the firm's risk management culture was altered without adequate transition planning. The memo had been received, it had been filed, it had not been acted on, it had simply been sitting there, in the firm's own records, for 3 years, waiting patiently to be proven right. Margaret Calloway never spoke publicly about what happened. She gave no press interviews in the months following the collapse. She did not post on social media. She did not respond to the coverage that named her, repeatedly, as the figure whose absence had made the collapse possible. She was reached once, briefly, by a journalist who managed to get her on the phone. He asked if she had anything to say about the situation at Prescott Capital. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I spent 20 years building something I was proud of. I hope the people who work there now are able to rebuild it. That is genuinely what I hope." She did not mention Daniel by name. She did not mention the envelope. She did not say anything that could be characterized as bitter or triumphant or angry. She expressed hope for the people inside a building she was no longer part of. And then she ended the call. It was the last public statement she ever made about Prescott Capital, or the man whose name was on the door. What happened to Prescott Capital after the collapse is a story of slow and unglamorous repair. The independent committee brought in a new interim chief executive, a woman with a long track record of stabilizing damaged institutions, someone with no prior connection to either Daniel or Margaret and no investment in the internal politics of what had happened. Under her leadership, the firm began the methodical work of rebuilding its risk frameworks, restoring client communication protocols, and addressing the documentation concerns that had triggered everything. Several clients who had left returned, not all, but enough to stabilize the asset base at a level the firm could operate from. It was not a full recovery, it was a survival. And in surviving, the firm became something that people who work there now describe in terms that would have been recognizable to anyone who knew it in its earliest years: quieter, more careful, more willing to slow down, and ask the question that Margaret had always insisted on asking before any significant decision was made. What happens if this goes wrong? Daniel Prescott gave an interview in 2021, 2 years after the collapse, that was widely read and discussed. He spoke with a degree of honesty that is, by the standards of people who have lost $10 billion in a single day, genuinely unusual. He said, among other things, "There is a version of success that looks like everything from the outside and is hollow from the inside. I built the outside. Margaret built everything that was real, and I convinced myself, for a long time, that those two things were the same. They were not the same. I understand that now in a way I did not understand it then, and the cost of learning it was something I would not wish on anyone, including myself. It is, as public reflections go, more honest than most. Whether it is commensurate with what happened, with 20 years of marriage in 11, years of partnership and a name removed from a door and an envelope handed across a desk while he looked at his phone, that is not a question a magazine interview can answer. That is a question each person who hears this story has to sit with for themselves. Margaret Calloway launched Calloway Advisory Partners in February 2020, 10 months after the envelope. Her name on the door, just hers. Clean and unambiguous and exactly the right size. She did not solicit a single client from Prescott Capital directly. She did not need to. Within the first 8 months of opening, 17 of the firm's original long-term clients had moved a portion of their portfolios to her new firm. Not all of their capital, just enough. A gesture that, in the investment world, carries a meaning that no statement or press release can replicate. A vote of confidence cast in the only currency that has always mattered to Margaret Calloway, which is trust. By the end of her second year in operation, Calloway Advisory Partners was managing just under $2 billion in assets. She had done in 24 months, alone, what had taken 8 years to do the first time with someone else's name beside hers. And on the door of her new office, in clean and unambiguous letters, was a single name, hers, just hers. And it was exactly the right size. Margaret moved with Rachel and James into a house in a neighborhood she had always loved and Daniel had always found too quiet. She planted a garden in the first spring after the separation, which Rachel helped her with on weekends, and which James photographed for a school project about growth and renewal that his teacher gave the highest grade she had given all year. She slept more than she had slept in 20 years. She read books she had been meaning to read for a decade. She took long walks in the mornings, in the specific silence of a neighborhood before it starts its day, and people who saw her on those walks describe a woman who looked, gradually and unmistakably, like someone returning to herself, not performing recovery, not performing anything, simply living at her own pace, in her own space, without editing herself to fit inside someone else's story. For the first time in a very long time, the life she was living had her name on all of it, and she was, by every account of the people close to her, at peace with it in a way that had nothing to do with what had happened to Daniel or to Prescott Capital, and everything to do with who she had always been underneath everything she had given away. This is not a story about $10 billion. The number is real, and the collapse was real, and the consequences for shareholders and employees were real, and none of that should be minimized. But the $10 billion is not the point. The point is what the $10 billion reveals about something far more fundamental, about how we value the people whose love and labor hold things together, about how easily the story of a shared life gets reorganized around the most visible person rather than the most essential one, and about what happens when the person who has been made invisible decides, quietly and without drama, to stop. Margaret Calloway did not destroy Daniel Prescott. She did not organize his downfall or coordinate a campaign against him or do a single thing that was not completely within her legal and ethical rights. She simply stopped holding something up, and it turned out that stopping was enough. Because what she had been holding was heavier than anyone, including perhaps Daniel himself, had ever fully understood, and the moment she put it down, the world finally saw how much it weighed. So here is what I want you to carry with you when this video ends. Not a lesson about business, not a lesson about investment firms or governance structures or the mechanics of a market collapse. A question about the people in your own life who hold things together quietly, without credit, without recognition, without their name on any of the doors their work is keeping open. Do you see them? Do you tell them that you see them? Do you say out loud, regularly and without waiting for a special occasion, what their presence in your life is actually worth? And if you are one of those people, if you are watching this and recognizing yourself in Margaret's story, if you are the one whose name is not on the door, whose contribution is not in the highlight reel, whose love and labor and precision and patience is the invisible infrastructure of something that would not exist without you, then I want you to hear this as clearly as I can possibly say it. What you do matters. It has always mattered. The fact that no one has put a number on it does not mean the number is not there. It is there. And one day, in one way or another, the world has a way of making it visible. Margaret's world made it visible on a Tuesday in June when $10 billion disappeared. Yours does not have to cost that much to count. We will be back next week with another story. And if this one stayed with you, if the image of a woman setting an envelope on a desk and picking up her notepad and walking out with her head up hit you somewhere you were not expecting, then you already know where the subscribe button is.